In today's video, we're going to take a look at several bands and even genres of music rock legend Jimi Hendrix didn't count himself a fan of. Jimi Hendrix didn't hide his feelings about one of rock and roll's most prolific and controversial bands, Led Zeppelin. The musician thought that the high praise of Zeppelin wasn't warranted, given that in his and many people's opinions, they weren't very original. Even to this day, Led Zeppelin has been frequently accused of stealing music from other artists without properly crediting them. Vanilla Fudge drummer Carmine Appice would recall in a 2006 interview a conversation that he had with Hendrix, recalling, "Jimi Hendrix personally told me that he didn't like Zeppelin because they were like excess baggage and that they stole from everybody." Despite Hendrix criticizing Led Zeppelin, he would praise drummer John Bonham, with Zeppelin frontman Robert Plant recalling in an interview, "I remember Hendrix coming up to Bonzo at a club in New York, and in those days, everybody used to jam. It was at a place called Steve Paul's Scene. It was Buddy Miles and Hendrix and Jeff Beck. There was loads of us, me, Rod Stewart, people all over the place." He would go on to add, "Hendrix came up to Bonzo and said, 'You know what? You got a foot like a rabbit.'" Hendrix would also praise guitarist Jimmy Page, calling him, and I quote, "a great guitarist," but the pair never got a chance to jam, with Page telling the interviewer, "I never saw him play either. I'm really upset with myself for never seeing him. I really wanted to hear him." It may be surprising given that Jimi Hendrix and Pink Floyd's music were often lumped in together as being psychedelic rock, but Hendrix didn't count himself a fan of Pink Floyd's music, at least initially. The Jimi Hendrix Experience would also tour with Pink Floyd in the UK as part of a package tour in 1967. However, it seemed like his opinion of the band would change over time. The 2012 book Hendrix on Hendrix, which contains an extensive collection of his interviews, including some pretty obscure ones, sees the musician asked in January of 1967 about the up-and-coming psychedelic scene. He would respond, "When these cats say, 'Look at the band, they're playing psychedelic music and all they're really doing is flashing lights and playing Johnny Be Good with the wrong chords, it's terrible.'" The interviewer would ask Hendrix if he ever saw Pink Floyd play live, and he'd respond, "I've heard they have beautiful lights, but they don't sound like nothing." He would stress in a separate interview he didn't want to be lumped in with what the press labeled was psychedelic rock or hippie music, adding, "It bothers us because psychedelic only means mind expansion anyway. I can't hear one single word the Pink Floyd are saying," he would remark. Fast forward a few years later, in the summer of 1970, a month or so before Hendrix's death, he gave an interview where he seemed to change his tune on Pink Floyd, telling Melody Maker about the future of his own music, revealing, "With the music, we will paint pictures of Earth and space so that the listener can be taken somewhere. It will be druggy music. I agree, it could be something on similar lines to what Pink Floyd are tackling. They don't know it, but people like Pink Floyd are the mad scientists of this day and age." Jimi Hendrix would awkwardly share the stage with the Doors frontman Jim Morrison on two occasions, and both instances didn't really go well. The first would be in New York at a club called The Scene in March of '68. Also at the club that night was Janis Joplin, who didn't seem to be a big fan of the Doors' Jim Morrison. Hendrix was jamming that night on stage with a group of musicians, and it was at one point during the night Morrison, who was completely inebriated, jumped on stage, grabbed the mic, and started making some inaudible noises in the microphone. Morrison at one point got on his knees and pretended to perform a lewd act on Hendrix while he played the guitar. Meanwhile, Janis Joplin would hit Morrison over the head with a bottle and then proceeded to pour a drink over him. All three musicians were soon seen rolling around on the floor, with Morrison being injured. Then almost 4 weeks later in Montreal, Canada, Morrison once again tried to interrupt Jimi Hendrix playing on stage. Morrison reportedly told Hendrix, hey Jimmy, let me come up and sing, and we'll do the shit together." So Jimmy goes, "That's okay, fella, I can handle it myself." And he said, "Do you know who I am? I'm Jim Morrison of the Doors." "Yeah," said Jimmy, "I know who you are, and I'm Jimi Hendrix." It wasn't just specific musicians or bands, but soul and popular music as well that Hendrix wasn't a fan of. He would remark in one interview about his disdain for the so-called Motown sound, recalling, "To me, the Motown sound is very artificial and very commercial, and very electronically made, a synthetic soul sound." He would go on to say, "It isn't the real sound of black artists. It's so commercial and put together, so beautifully, I don't feel anything from it." By 1967, Jimi Hendrix was a rising star in the UK, but he was virtually unknown stateside. The Monkees would have massive crowds in America, and it was a perfect opportunity to get Jimi Hendrix in front of a lot of people in the States. Hendrix himself expressed that he wasn't a big fan of the idea slamming the Monkees in an interview in Melody Maker, recalling, "Oh God, I hate them, dishwater. You can't knock anybody for making it, but people like the Monkees," he'd ask. The Monkees, meanwhile, were big fans of Hendrix.
You like the Monkees? They don't even play their own instruments. No! No!
I don't know what's sadder, the fact that that episode deals with Marge's fear of air travel, or the fact that The Simpsons used to be funny. Anyways, getting back to the story, 1967 saw one of the strangest musical pairings in history. Teeny boppers The Monkees, who were huge at the time, would tour America with Jimi Hendrix as their opener, or at least that was the plan. Exactly whose idea it was to pair the musicians together isn't really clear. Some sources claim it was Hendrix's manager Mike Jeffries, while others claim it was the Monkees themselves. But either way, it would be an ill-fated tour that unraveled after only several dates. By 1967, Jimi Hendrix was a rising star in the UK, but virtually unknown stateside. The Monkees had massive crowds, and it was a perfect opportunity to get the guitarist and singer in front of a lot of people in the United States. Hendrix himself wasn't a big fan of the idea slamming the Monkees prior to the tour, during an interview with Melody Maker saying, "Oh God, I hate them, dishwater. You can't knock anybody for making it, but people like the Monkees," he'd ask. The Monkees, meanwhile, were big fans of Hendrix. Monkey Mike Nesmith first heard of Hendrix while he was at a dinner party with John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and Eric Clapton. Soon afterwards, Monkey member Mickey Dolenz saw Hendrix perform in New York, telling Forbes magazine, "I first saw Hendrix when he was still Jimmy James and the Blue Flames. I was in New York and somebody said I had to come down from Greenwich Village to see this guy play the guitar with his teeth." Soon afterwards, Dolenz and his bandmates saw the guitar virtuoso perform at the 1967 Monterey Pop Festival and instantly became fans. Dolenz would reveal in his autobiography, "I'm a Believer," "You can't imagine what it must have been like for an act like Jimi Hendrix opening for the Monkees. It was evident from the start that we were witness to a rare and phenomenal talent. I would stand in the wings and watch and listen in awe," he'd remember. Hendrix would open his first show of the tour in Jacksonville, Florida, to a less than enthusiastic crowd. Dolenz would recall in his book how fans reacted to Hendrix, revealing, "The parents were probably not too crazy about having to sit through a Monkees concert, much less see a black guy in a psychedelic blouse playing music from hell, holding his guitar like he was effing it, then lighting it on fire. Jimmy would amble out onto stage, fire up the amps, and break into Purple Haze, and the kids in the audience would instantly drown him out with We Want Davey. God, it was embarrassing." Hendrix was supposed to play a total of 29 shows with the Monkees, but bowed out of the tour after only 8 dates. While the Monkees and Hendrix got along on tour, it was the crowds who weren't so enthusiastic about Hendrix's performances. The final show would take place on July 17, 1967, and some stories have suggested that the musician had ended his set by saluting the crowd with his middle finger and smashing his guitar. There was also some rumors circulating around this time that he may have been kicked off the tour after a group called the Daughters of the American Revolution claimed that his show was, and I quote, "too erotic." Dolenz was sad to see Hendrix leave the tour, revealing in his book, "I was sorry to see him go. We did have some great times running around the New York City psychedelic scene like kids in a candy store, tripping at the Electric Circus, and jamming until all hours of the night in our hotel room." And shortly after Hendrix left the tour, both of his records, including Purple Haze and Are You Experienced, started to get the attention they deserved in America, finally climbing up the charts. That does it for today's video, guys. Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit the like button and subscribe, and we'll see you again tomorrow on Rock and Roll True Stories.